and welcome to The Game Changers, the podcast where you'll hear from extraordinary, trailblazing women in sport, breaking down barriers and challenging the status quo for women and girls everywhere. I'm Sue Anstis, a founding trustee of the Women's Sport Trust charity and the founder of Fearless Women, a company with a powerful ambition to drive positive change for women's sport. I'm thrilled to say that this series of The Game Changers is supported by Sport England, who've done so much to tackle the inequalities women face across all areas of sport. From the much celebrated This Girl Can campaign and initiatives that help shape school sport for girls, to schemes that encourage more female volunteers in the workforce, support female coaches and officials, and ensure more women from all backgrounds take leadership positions on the boards of our sports organisations. My guest today is Alison Oliver, Chief Executive of the Youth Sport Trust, the charity working to ensure every child enjoys the life-changing benefits that come from sport and play. A former PE teacher and a fellow Loughborough graduate, Ali's hugely respected across the entire sports and education sector. I began by asking Ali how sport had been a part of her life as a child.
Well, sport was a huge part of my growing up. I didn't necessarily have massively sporty parents, but I was a bit of a hyperactive child. I needed channeling somewhere, and it was probably partway through my primary years where I found sport. And as usual, as it is for many people, it was a teacher. There weren't many male teachers actually in the primary school, but there was a male teacher called Mr. Martin at Charlestown Primary School in Cornwall. And he was obviously passionate about sport himself. And he just got us children involved in all sorts of sports, cross-country running to athletics to gymnastics. He did everything. I think I just found both something that I enjoyed doing. I suppose that's the first thing, is I just loved moving. I loved being active. I loved trying to find out what my body could do, and I loved practicing and trying to improve and all those sorts of things. But I also found people who had similar interests to me. I found friendship groups through sport. So that was sort of where it started. And then all the way through my school years, I was blessed with amazing teachers, passionate, inspirational individuals who I connected with as a person, as a student. But also all of my youth was dominated by sport, and it gave me the opportunity to find adults as role models beyond my parents. So the opportunity to, there are all sorts of different people out there, and they nurtured in me all sorts of different interests. But also just that brilliant bit about being in an intergenerational environment where you have to grow up a little bit when you're a youngster working with adults or playing with adults, but also you have to take responsibility for younger children. And I thrived on all of that. I needed a purpose.
Did you play sport outside of school as well?
Yes, yeah, I did. Netball was really the sport that I was most passionate about, but I was in the athletics club. I did triathlon. That was in a hockey club, but netball was probably 3 or 4 times a week by the time I was sort of year 8. I think that was definitely my greatest love.
And looking back, do you think you always knew you wanted to be a PE teacher?
I don't think I did. No, it was never. Interesting. My parents never had those conversations with me about what do you want to do when you get older, what's your career. They were brilliant. They just let me be a bit free range, let me roam about and work things out. And I went quite a long way down the line of joining the RAF. Actually, sport was obviously huge within the forces, and at the time I was a child, the forces were a very different place. We hadn't been in conflict as a country for years. And I understood it. Well, I misunderstood it, that it was a place where you played sport and you didn't necessarily take responsibility for protecting your nation. And it was only really quite close to the end of the selection process for university bursaries that I decided, I don't know that I want to commit to a commission for the next 5 years or whatever. And at that point then, which I was probably my beginning of my second year at university, I then started to think about other places where you could pursue that passion of sport.
And I know you've said, I don't know where I'd be if I hadn't had sport. You clearly had a great experience of PE. Are you concerned that children today don't have the same chance to fall in love with sport as you did?
Yeah, it's obviously one of the greatest concerns for both me as a person, but in my professional role at the Youth Sport Trust. I think there are so many things that have changed. Clearly, the context within which children grow up is changed. Communities aren't necessarily either as safe or perceived to be as safe. And a huge part of finding myself through sport was, I used to cycle to the netball club and the athletics club. I had got my independence from travel. I had time away from my family and all those sorts of things. So I think they were a big part of my love of it, not just the moving bit. But I also think in schools now, the status of physical education is in trouble. In fact, I think there are lots of schools where children don't get adequate time on the curriculum for PE. And I think all sorts of things have happened at the time for good reason. But in reality, the PE experience now is not what I had. I had an experience before GCSE or A level. Those things didn't exist. Teachers were able to absolutely focus on the curriculum delivery, but lots of after school clubs. They didn't have the marking and the responsibilities. The national curriculum hadn't even been existed, didn't even exist. And I think while those things have been good, for some reasons, they've taken away, I guess, the spontaneity of teachers and the ability for teachers to go where students feel they want to go and to be connected to the child first instead of connected to the curriculum first. And that's what we tend to see now is some amazing teaching in the relation to the curriculum, but it's not necessarily delivering the outcome that is right for every child. And hence, too often we know that people tell me, PE put me off sport for life. And when we look at Sport England's active lives data, we know that physical education is turning off more children than it's turning on. So yeah, it does worry me, Sue. Yeah.
Interesting. I think that freedom around active travel as well, that's another conversation, but I hadn't really considered, obviously, that in terms of our growing up, that was obviously a huge part of attending clubs and sports and so on too, wasn't it? You and I both went to Loughborough. You arrived the year I left, actually. I've looked back and realised that you got there in 89 and I'd left the year before. So I was going to ask you around, I guess, your desire to become a PE teacher. So you just did a PGCE there, did you then?
Yeah, I did a 3-year sports science and geography degree. And that's my other passion, the outdoors and the environment. And then, as I say, decided to stay on to do a PGCE. And probably having ended up as a PE teacher, that would be one of my regrets, that if I'd known I wanted to be a PE teacher, no question now, I would have gone for a 4-year BEd, as they used to be. Clearly, again, not so many of those courses around now, sadly. But all the teachers I met during my teaching career and since, who had 4 years to focus on the skills, knowledge and expertise of teaching, were always better practitioners than I ever was.
Makes sense, doesn't it, really? It makes sense to have 4 years of it immersed in it, really.
Yeah.
And you taught PE in Essex, and then you were head of PE at Millfield School as well. So you didn't then continue your career as a PE teacher. So why was that?
Again, really good question. So I was really privileged as a child. When I reached the age of 16, I was hugely fortunate to get a bursary to attend Millfield School as a student for my sixth form. And my goodness, it was like for a young, slightly wayward child growing up in Cornwall to end up at an independent school and one that had such a great reputation for sport. I thought I was on a summer camp for 2 years, if I'm honest. It was amazing. I sucked up every opportunity the place had going. So when I started my career, as you said, started teaching in Southend, in Essex, and had the opportunity to teach A-level PE in, I think, my second or third year of teaching when it was just coming in. Millfield then advertised for a head of PE, but had to have A-level experience. And if I'm really honest, Sue, there weren't many people around then that had A-level teaching experience because it was so new. It was, although teaching there was a huge privilege and leading the department, it's never a good idea to go back, was the lesson I learned, from being, like I said, on a summer camp as a student, suddenly the other side of the desk, as it were. And it wasn't, I didn't enjoy it. It came too early in my career as a head of department. I wasn't ready for it. I needed more time teaching. And I guess at that sort of stage, once you've stepped into the independent sector, you've stepped into a different world, and it was a great experience. But then I started to look in different places and went into initial teacher training from there at the University of Bath.
And how did that come about? Was that with Jed Roddy?
Yeah, yes, it was. Jed Roddy, who was the director of sport at the University of Bath back in the 90s and early 2000s, he came to deliver a general studies lecture on a Saturday morning at Milford. And I went in with my tutor group to sit and listen, as you always had to. And I can just remember it was like a light bulb went on. He will always be one of the greatest inspirations in my life. He was such an ambitious soul, huge passion for sport, and saw no reason why we couldn't be as successful as Australia. And his lecture was about establishing the British Academy of Sport, as it was originally called, or going to be called, which was sort of the equivalent of the AIS. And he was talking about it, and it was going to be at Bath University, and we were going to, grow a talent pipeline in this country, which culminated there. And I was just kind of enraptured by it. And to be fair to the poor Gassard, I then hounded him and bothered him after that. I took my netball team from Millfield over there and made a point of beating the university team, and then writing to him and telling him that my coaching would be of value to the university, all this rubbish. And eventually an opportunity came up to work in the education department, actually, not in Jed's department, on the physical education teacher training programme. And it was a big step, actually, for me, not only out of teaching, whatever it was, 10 years into my career, but also it was quite a significant drop in status from a head of department in a great independent school for sport. It was kind of half the salary. And that was probably the only time in my life that my parents did sort of engage in my career choices. But it just ended up being the right decision for me, and moved from leading the PE course to getting involved in the most extraordinary adventures and projects in sports development that anyone could ever dream of, really, under Jed's leadership.
And how long were you at Bath for?
I was at the university for 7 years.
And then onto the Youth Sport Trust. So how did that come about?
Well, you're going to see a theme here soon. So one of the things I did at Bath was I set up the Team Bath netball programme. And in order to cobble together a budget for it, I formed a partnership with the local girls' secondary school, just a state school, Oldfield School in Bath, which had just taken on the role of being a specialist sports college, which I didn't really know what it was at the time. And I twisted the arm of the head and the head of PE there to host some girls in their sixth form who were talented netballers from the Southwest region, to be my first cohort of Team Bath players. And ended up being on the governing body of the school, one of the governors, and ended up being taken by the head of PE to the very first Specialist Sports Colleges conference in 97, hosted by Baroness Sue Campbell, sitting in the audience, had another moment, just like I did when I listened to Jed, another inspirational individual, powerful orator, talking about a vision for children and physical activity and the role it should play in their life, and kind of it almost a similar pathway. Okay, how do I find my way to get a job at the Youth Sport Trust? And kept waiting, and eventually an opportunity arose.
Excellent. I love that. What was your first role at the Youth Sport Trust?
I went in as a post. It doesn't exist anymore. It was called Implementation Director, Sue, which I arrived in 2004, which was 2.5 years into the PE School Sport Club Links strategy, which was the strategy which put school sport partnerships on the ground. So my job was to lead our field team working out in the regions to first map out which schools would be in which school sport partnerships, working with local authorities, and then work with the Department for Education to allocate the funds as they became available. I think we had 10 phases in the end of rolling out school sport partnerships between 2000, when they started in 2002, to 2008 when we got the full rollout. And then we had 2 years with all 450 school sport partnerships before, unfortunately, that all came to an end.
Yes, I'm going to come on to that in a moment, actually. You also, I know I've heard you mention, but you obviously worked for Steve Granger. He was CEO for a while while you were there too, and obviously now doing amazing things at the RFU in terms of driving participation. So what do you feel you learned from him as a leader, perhaps in a different way to Sue?
I've had some extraordinary leadership mentors in my career, and Steve would be another one. If anyone who listens to this podcast knew Sue and Steve when they worked together, I don't think you get many teams that are both as collectively extraordinary as they were, but how brilliantly they complemented each other. And I think that's one of the things I learned from Sue is never put people around you that are like you. Try and find people that complement you and are different. And Sue was always brilliant at articulating a vision, brilliant at engaging people and bringing them on board on that mission. What Steve did is turn the mission into a reality. He is a brilliant development thinker, manages to translate vision into practical action. He just used to develop budgets within the flick of a finger. You know, if we were in a fairly significant meeting, whether it was civil servants or a corporate partner, and someone would suggest, how would you implement this? Steve would have divided by 32, multiplied it by 12, added 2 more and said, right, that's how much it'll cost. And it'll take us X number of weeks to roll it out on the ground and implement it. And he just had brilliant ways of coming up with very tangible, simple actions. And it's one of the things I think gets lost sometimes in sports development. We can end up with overcomplicated partnerships and overly thought methods of implementing things. And actually, the best way to create change or create transformation that I learned from Steve was just break it down into a number of bite-sized bits and start delivering the bits. And eventually you'll kind of get there. And if you waste too much time trying to create the bigger picture without getting on the grassroots level, you miss the opportunity.
I love that. Yeah, absolutely. So you've mentioned 2 extraordinary mentors in terms of leadership there. How would your team describe you today as a leader, do you think, if I spoke to them?
Ooh. Always a difficult question to answer, isn't it? I'll tell you what I would hope they might say, and then I'll probably add a few things I think they might say. I hope they would say that I'm mission-led. I think that's what I endeavour to be. As I said earlier, I always needed a purpose in life. I was not very good, and I was pretty misbehaved if I didn't have a purpose or a focus. And the reason why I've been at the YST for as long as I have is because I just absolutely believe in what we stand for. I'm also quite anchored by my values, and I find compromising my values really, really hard. So they probably say I'm fairly stubborn on some things, but I'm fairly consistent as well. I don't move about. My position on things doesn't change too often. And I think they would probably say that I'm a bit controlling and sometimes have too many opinions on things, I suspect. I always struggle with that balance. I often have an idea about how we should do things. And coming back to that point I raised earlier by Sue, have to always remind myself that other people have better ideas than I do.
It's very self-aware of you to recognise that too, isn't it? And you mentioned the kind of mission of the Youth Sport Trust. So how has that changed? You're celebrating 25 years this year. How has that changed across that quarter of a century?
To be honest, the mission hasn't changed one iota. So the mission has always been to build a brighter future for young people through the power of sport. And that's exactly what we do today. What clearly has changed enormously is the context in which young people grow up, the opportunities available to them, the challenges that they face, and indeed the status of the subject, as we touched on earlier. So while the mission has remained the same, and indeed our values, which are trust, responsibility, integrity, and partnership working, they've always been at the heart of what we do. But we've had to stay agile. Sometimes we've been forced to be agile, actually. We've had to keep evolving. And certainly in the last 5 years, we've moved from a focus on how do you make sport more accessible and more enjoyable to now how do we make sport more meaningful, more relevant and more purposeful without destroying the enjoyment and the accessibility. But sadly, I wish sport for kids could be recognised for the value it has in its own right and not have to justify itself against other agendas. But when we've got 1 in 10 children with a diagnosable mental health condition, we've got a third of children overweight, risk of obesity, we've got children are now the loneliest group in society, even when we've traditionally had the elderly occupying that space. We've got all these issues. And if young people, parents and schools don't really understand the role sport and play has in those agendas, it becomes marginalised. It becomes something frivolous or something just for those kids like Ali who needed it and who loved it, but it's not really relevant for everybody else. And I firmly believe with the state of children's health and well-being, physical education absolutely sits alongside English, maths and science as core foundations for everything else in a child's education and development. So there's been a real shift in us from, more sport development to more sport for development. And that's not saying that the Youth Sport Trust ever just developed sport. It did always have that building a brighter future or changing lives note to it. But now it's got a much harder edge. And in many ways, I really think the Youth Sport Trust feels more of a good and right cause for charitable status and to be seeking, donations and public funding for than it ever has done in my 17 years with the charity.
And does that frustrate you, that looking back at all the work you've done across all that time, where we are now and how sport is perceived in schools and PE? And how do you deal with that personally, with that frustration?
There are big parts of it that, yes, do frustrate me, Sue. And the reason why I get frustrated is because, and so many people will say this from their own careers, is we keep flipping reinventing the wheel and we don't build on things that we've learned in the past. And we very rarely, because of the status of education and indeed sport being very bound up in politics, we constantly get changes, shifts in strategy and policy, which break momentum. They stop that cycle of learning and improvement. So that frustrates me, that many people will understandably say, well, if the YST has been around for 25 years and you do such a good job, why are we in the state we're in now? And part of my answer would be, look at the journey and look at the times when not just we, but everybody who's worked so passionately and hard on this agenda has made massive strides. And then we've been taken backwards by political decisions, or as we probably will be now, things completely out of anyone's control. But then the other part of it is less frustrating, which is, as I've just described, the context keeps changing. So the fact that more children are inactive today than they've ever been is not because the system's failed. It's because the world has become infinitely more complex. The digital age particularly has created competition for children's time like nothing else on this earth. And lifestyles of parents and carers have become much busier. There's less time for supporting children's interest in play and sport, and less disposable income to invest on those things as well. Part of it's really frustrating, and I'd love it if we could sort that. The other part of it is the nature of living in the world that does inevitably keep moving and changing.
Absolutely. And that's fascinating, isn't it? That the need for the Youth Sport Trust and all it does is ever bigger than it was in that context too. You mentioned the changing political landscape, and obviously in 2010 things shifted dramatically for the Youth Sport Trust with a change of government. Can you just tell us briefly what happened there and what you remember from that time?
Yeah, I mean, it still is quite a painful memory, actually. But it's no good keep going back and saying, if only things change, don't they? I'll probably answer this in three ways. I believe what happened, number one, was we as a charity and lots of people working in this space probably hadn't thought through the risk and the possibility of that strategy and the government funding and the infrastructure that was built around it ever coming to an end. And had we had those thoughts or premonitions, we absolutely would have done some things differently to build more sustainability into the structures. But having said that, one of the greatest things about the school sport partnership model was it didn't parachute people into schools who were then going to be cut off if something like 2010 happened. It funded the release of primary link teachers and school sport coordinators, so that if and when the money did go, those people were still in the schools and they had now more skills, experience, relationships, etc. So there were things that were very clever in the design of it. But we certainly weren't ready 2 years out from Olympic and Paralympic Games in our home country to lose it. So I think the first bit is, I remember thinking, why didn't we see this coming and why didn't we do things differently? The second recollection I have is the way that it was done and the arguments that were made to do it. And it felt at the time that, rightly or wrongly, the one statistic that hadn't moved significantly was used to justify the demise of school sport partnerships, and that was around participation in competition. I can remember someone found the statistic around competitive school sport, and the percentage of children taking part in competition hadn't grown. And surely school sport is hung off competition. And if we hadn't sorted that out, then the strategy didn't work. And, you know, what's really interesting is the strategy wasn't about, at that time, competition, because competition was largely for those who got it and had more ability or more ambition. We've been focusing on those less active young people and getting more engaged. But anyway, that was something. So I learned a lot about politics and how things can unravel quickly and how weak spots can be found in strategies and work. And then the final thing, I think we've always been in the hands of those politicians who make key decisions, and we've had amazing politicians who've had a real belief in the power of physical education and school sport, not just for sport outcomes, but for health, for education, for community integration. You know, we've had people who've really got the sport for development agenda in Secretary of State roles, and they've created some of those, when I talk about the history, some of those huge acceleration curves where we've made massive progress. And then there are some politicians who, probably for no fault of their own, didn't have a great physical education experience, had other passions and interests, which is quite relevant, you know, and reasonable, but whose own personal experiences then influenced policy and decision making. And clearly at that time, you know, the mix of politicians was different. There was a need for the new coalition government to sweep clean some things and introduce new policies of their own. So it was those three things, I think.
And did you consider taking a different path at the time as all that happened?
No, to be honest, never. No, didn't cross my mind at all. I guess I felt at that moment in time, bring it on. Come on. This is where the fight starts. You know, I'd arrived at the Youth Sport Trust when people had fought for the funding, strategy was in place. It was a wonderful job. It was busy, but I didn't have to do too much fighting. And by the time the strategy ended, I was the director of sport at that time. I'd moved into a new role, and it was like siege mentality, really. We were right. Okay, now is the moment as a charity we stand up and speak for what we believe in most strongly. So it was a whirlwind. We also had to restructure the organisation within a matter of months. We lost probably about 80 or 90 staff in one go. So my job then was to play my part in helping to manage all of that. So it didn't cross my mind at all. And ever since then, there's always been a new challenge or a new opportunity. And, you know, having the privilege to take the leadership role myself a bit further down the line, I always felt there's a job to be done here, and now isn't the right time to be moving on. And actually, just because it was harder work and not so well funded, it didn't change the purpose of the organisation and what I loved about it.
And how did it feel to be made CEO of this organisation?
The most frightening thing in my life. It felt like an immense privilege. Couldn't say anything other than that. I went for it when John Steele went for the post.
Okay.
And was unsuccessful, and decided, you know, that he's a better leader. He's got more experience, absolutely had more experience and more to offer to the role at that point. And I learned a lot working under him. So I don't know, maybe there's a lesson here. If you hang around long enough, someone eventually gives you the job. But
it's interesting though. Sorry, I spoke to Liz Nichol on this, and she had applied and didn't get, and she shared that as well, and then went again. That's about, you know, if you really want something and not thinking just because you don't get the first time, it's not right for you in the longer term too.
Yeah, I think so. And I was very comfortable with the decision that I wasn't the right person. The feedback I had was really helpful to me developmentally. And as I say, I love the organisation. And I read a book recently, actually, well, not recently, it's probably about 3 years ago now, that someone passed on to me. Don't know if you've read it. It's called Consigliere. It's a book by a guy called Richard, I don't know how you pronounce his name, Hintner, I think it is. And it's all about, the word consigliere comes from the mafia.
The mafia.
Yeah, kind of a leadership role in the mafia. But the whole book talks about number ones and number twos in organisations, and which is the more crucial role in an organisation, the number one or the number two. And it doesn't really come to a conclusion, but it just helps you understand if you enjoy leading and you have a passion for it, you don't have to aspire to be the number one. You can find lots of fulfillment and undertake a crucial role in an organisation in a different role. And that's kind of what I found with John, I think, was great. You lead and I'll do whatever you need me to do. I think the most difficult time for me as chief exec of the YST was when Sue stepped away as chair. It was daunting taking it on, having known the sorts of people that had been chief exec in the past, in Sue, Steve, and then John. But I honestly didn't know when Sue left us whether the YST had a future, because Sue's fingerprints and heartbeat are all, they still are all over the YST, but she created it. So John Beckwith, it was his vision with Duncan Goodhue, and so John invested the cash to get the charity going, but Sue built it. So that was probably the most daunting and frightening time, really, is if we were only a great charity because Sue was at the helm, then I was going to fail miserably. And also this charity that had been built up so many years would not survive. And you're supposed to come in as a chief exec and kind of be a caretaker for what you pick up and try and leave it in as least a good a place as you found it, if not, if you can make it better. And I thought, gosh, this is going to go horribly wrong. But it was testament to Sue's leadership and what she'd built in the place that she walked away. And of course, we missed her desperately. And there were lots of things we still miss, but she had created something that was sustainable.
Fantastic. I want to move on, if I can, a little bit more around women and girls, or girls in sport, really. Why do you think the sport matters so much, particularly for girls in schools?
Well, all of the work that we've done at the YST has helped me have a very different view of it, because obviously I'm a female and I've enjoyed sport and I've learned a lot from it. But I've, in my teaching career and in all of my career, really, I've come across plenty of women for whom sport has damaged them. So whether that is the way in which it's been delivered, the approach to that, or whether there's been sort of no sense of the value and purpose of this thing called sport ever articulated to girls. And both of those things now, I think, are much, much clearer. Is if we want all women and girls to enjoy sport, we need to really understand what feels like fun, what's enjoyable, and what doesn't feel like fun, and minimize those things that are barriers and restrict engagement and enjoyment. But at the same time, absolutely get over the fact that not everybody's going to love sport. For lots of people, it will never feel enjoyable. It'll never feel fun. So understanding its purpose for lots of young girls in terms of managing their stress and anxiety, helping them improve their self-esteem and their perception of body image. For some young women, simply understanding that being active can change your mood, your cognitive performance, your ability to make decisions. All those sorts of buttons need to be pushed or explored to help women understand, or give women the chance to look at sport through a slightly different lens than just it makes me feel uncomfortable, or it's hard, or I haven't found a sport that I like. But the other reason why I think it's so crucial is because women are 50% of the population. We occupy at least 50% of the parenting responsibilities. In some professions, we're more dominant. So primary education, there are far more women in the profession. So not only while you're growing up is it really important, but it's so important for attitudes and perceptions of physical activity later on in your both your career and your family life, I think.
And the Girls Active programme's obviously been hugely successful. Can you just tell us a little bit more about that and why you think supporting girls to become young leaders themselves can be so powerful?
Yeah, so thank you for giving me the opportunity to talk about it. So, Girls Active has been going since, I think, 2006. It started off. We had a partnership at the time with Dame Kelly Holmes as the National School Sport Champion, and she helped be the figurehead for the very first Girls Active programme. And it's evolved. We've continually evaluated it and refined it, and we now deliver it in partnership with Women in Sport, with amazing investment from Sport England lottery funding, and they're hugely committed to the programme and where it fits in the This Girl Can campaign, of course. But it was built on the simple belief that if we want to close the gap in participation for girls, the first thing we must do is give the girls a voice in it. And I think that had been missed for quite a long time. Even, in my early days at the Youth Sport Trust, I remember us being involved with Nike and the Girls in Sport project, a huge research project to understand the barriers. And it did a great listening exercise. And then we implemented action on the back of that, changing PE kits and changing requirements, showers, etc. And it led to the introduction of things like cheerleading and yoga and jazz dance into the PE curriculum. But it tended to be us listening and then the profession delivering back. And Girls Active has evolved over time to now be much more sensitive to the fact that role models, particularly for young teenage girls, are not teachers and adults. They're not even parents anymore. They're their peer group. And if we want to change the behaviour of young women and girls, we've got to harness the influences in a peer group, in some ways help them understand the influence they have and the power they have. These people, I can remember them from school, the girls who were the most influential, and all the other girls would just follow suit, follow that line. So helping those young women understand what influence they have, because that's a crucial part for them of their career. They're going to be the leaders of the future. They have that ability for people to follow them if it's channeled in the right way. So that's quite an important part. But then also kind of helping them understand the responsibility that they could have, and how if they expressed on behalf of the peer group what could be done, and they then worked in a team with the PE department to lead and manage the activity and market it, not just speak up and say what their friends want, but actually roll up their sleeves and get involved in it, they could make a real difference. And that indeed what's happened. So Girls Active has got a questionnaire for girls, which is implemented by girls. So we create in the school, some people don't like the term, but a GLAMS group, which is a girls leading a marketing sport group. And they manage the implementation of a questionnaire of their peers, harvest that in. They then have a sit-down formal meeting with the PE team and listen, and together kind of co-create what will be the curriculum and the extracurricular offer. And then those old notice boards that my PE teachers and I used to spend hours, putting borders around and getting all the team lists up. Those notice boards, in part, I've got a thing of the past because everyone's on these things. Girls are now taking responsibility for how they communicate after school sport and clubs, and they create the identity in their school. So many of them got their own brand for physical education now they've created. And again, I think that's just reflecting a changing world as girls are now engaged on social media and influencers are part of everyday life. We have to accept in school that if we want to influence behaviour, let's kind of harness some of those opportunities. So it's been in the schools where we've had the opportunity to deliver the programme, it's been revolutionary. Indeed, the teachers, who sometimes are a bit resistant to begin with, because hang on, I've trained for how many years to know how to do this, and you're telling me that the girls can? What could be more of a blessing than you turn up for a lesson and there are girls there who want to do it, instead of the stress and anxiety of how do you coerce people who really don't want to do it to take part. So I think it's worked on both fronts.
Do you ever worry, does it worry you, that in trying to appeal to girls, we risk over-feminising physical activity and moving away from traditional support? So rather than encouraging the schools to challenge the attitudes in society about women not being sweaty and sporty and strong, we go down that, and you mentioned Nike, the cheerleading and the hairdryers, and do we just reinforce those things?
It was a huge worry to me, actually, at one point, because I said I come from team sports, really. I was a team sport player, and I could see us being part of a shift almost that started to say team sports isn't what girls want and isn't right for girls, and we need to kind of move away from it and find these alternative things. And actually, when you talk to girls, and again, the research bears it out, girls love team sport. They want to be.
Why would they not?
They just don't want to be in a team that someone's told them they have to be in. They want to work out their own team.
Yeah.
So yes, I absolutely think that's the case. And to be honest, when the This Girl Can campaign first came out, I really struggled with it, because I struggled with some of the, I felt, messaging, which probably wasn't there. It was probably more about my baggage and seeing things that weren't there, about, I don't know, it created a kind of a stress in me around, I can't remember which one it was. I think it was the image that was, I jiggle, therefore I am. And I didn't want women not to be proud of their bodies, but I also didn't want sport to be perceived as only about jiggling. I was like, sports like this huge broad church, and that was my problem, because This Girl Can was targeting a certain group of women. It wasn't supposed to be targeting me. It was supposed to be targeting a broader group. But I think that the Team Up campaign that netball, cricket, and hockey ran on the back of their consecutive home World Cups was evidence, if ever we needed it, that actually girls love a team sport. They want to be in a team. We just need to recognise the barriers that we create sometimes in team selection, and the assumption that being part of a team sport means it has to be competitive. Yeah, I've had concerns about that at various points, as I've described, but I think it feels to me now we're in a really good place, notwithstanding obviously some of the very legitimate concerns post-COVID about where women's sport is now. Prior to the pandemic, there seemed to be female role models for everybody in sport. The This Girl Can opened up one end of the continuum, and the success of Team GB opened up the other end of the continuum, and it felt much more balanced than ever before.
And I guess at the other end of the continuum, we have seen some really negative stories recently about young women and men impacted by that overarching drive for medals in team sports, like gymnastics and athletics and swimming and cycling. And so how do you feel we protect the well-being of our young athletes to make sure sports do more for the whole child's well-being? Is that something that sits at all within your brief within the Youth Sport Trust?
From a talent perspective, Sue, do you mean?
Yeah, or just, I guess, helping to educate the sports in terms of the overall well-being of the child beyond on the performance pathway.
Yeah. So, yes, I mean, I guess it falls part of our brief anyway, that, making sure that children are safe and are respected and protected when they play sport is really, really important, and kind of cuts right to the heart of what we do. I think there's also this, in sports development for years, we've kind of talked about the old pyramid where, you get to the top by having a big grassroots, and gradually people get funneled to the top. And I think the world of performance sport now is so sophisticated at identifying the attributes which are more likely to make you world class, that it isn't just a straight pyramid model. So that means that young people, particularly, I think it was Chelsea War at UK Sport that showed me some amazing evidence around, Olympic medalists who'd stayed multi-sport for a considerable number of years, well into their late teenage years before they specialised. And that multi-sport experience is going to dilute any pressure from any specific sport. I think those early specialisation sports are always going to be at risk, because you know what? If you want to be the best in the world, you have to push the boundaries of human performance and mental toughness. When that is wrong is when we're doing that with children who are not physically and mentally developed and able to cope. So the sports where you can be at an Olympic Games as a 13-year-old or even younger, that's where it's the risk is. So I have no idea what the right answer is, but it does beg the question of whether performance sport should be accessible to people below a certain age, because of the risks that inherently come with it. Now the stakes are so high, it's going to always lead to not necessarily abuse or bullying or any of those, but it will lead to people having to push themselves right to the edge, and having to have people around them who take them to the edge, hopefully with their permission and their consent, but who they need to drive them to that place. What we've done quite a lot of work on, Sue, is sport parenting, and particularly helping parents to understand the role and responsibilities they have for their child in sport, particularly for the child with ambition or talent who is determined to push themselves, all the way. And that's been fascinating. When we have the privilege of delivering the school games national finals on behalf of, again, Sport England and the lottery and the various governing bodies that are involved, we run sport parent workshops in the evenings. And you would be amazed when we bring together a group of swimming parents with a group of netball parents with a group of track and field parents, the subcultures that exist and the boundaries on what's acceptable in different sports is huge. Again, it's not our job to tell a sport what's right and wrong, but to expose parents so that they can start to see there are other ways of supporting their child, because inevitably a gymnastics parent will have socialized so much with other gymnastics parents, they'll just think this is how it has to be and how it always is. But stick a gymnastics parent with a hockey parent and they're like, wow, okay, we're still talking about the same performance journey.
That's fascinating, yeah, isn't it? That's very interesting. I hadn't thought about that before, but what a great opportunity to help change some of that behaviour too. We mentioned elite athletes and ambassadors and Team GB, and I know you've worked really closely with some extraordinary female athletes. I'm thinking of like Alex Danson and Maggie Alfonsi, who talk about you on this podcast too. How are you today working with some of those elite female athletes in terms of inspiring younger women?
We're probably working less now than we've ever been, actually, which I think is a good thing in some ways, because the athletes who would have previously worked with us might have had fewer opportunities to raise their profile and express their views and interests back in the day. And therefore, we found it easier to work with people because they had fewer opportunities to do that. I think the fact we find it harder now is because there's lots of people trying to work with athletes in this way, which is amazing for the athlete community. But also, we're working with a mixture of athletes and non-athletes. So just in National School Sport Week this year, we brought on Dr. Radha Module, will be very familiar to many people from her radio and TV experiences as, a general practitioner, but with a role in the media talking to us about our health and well-being. And she's just been phenomenal, both with her perspective on play and sport for girls, but also for boys and girls. She appeals to a different audience, gives us a slightly different reach, and gets a different message across. So back in the day, I think Kelly Holmes and Denise Lewis, still have Hannah Cockcroft, Alex, you've mentioned Maggie, really privileged to work with them all. But now we have people like Dr. Radha, we have Kimberly Wyatt from the Pussycat Dolls, who's been a great champion for us for a number of years. And we'd like to work with more people for whom sport and physical activity is a central part of their life, and they can talk about it passionately and with purpose. But not, again, always just have ambassadors who are athletes, because the risk is then, again, is we're trying to inspire one segment of the audience.
Absolutely.
I can't thank enough the athletes that work for us, not just as ambassadors, but we have just over 100 now who are mentors for us, working on our Living for Sport programme and our mental health programme, where they've retrained part of their retirement for sport. They've retrained in mentoring and teaching, and they're working with us now on their programs, and they bring so much added value, not just in their experience, but their determination to still win, they bring to the YST. So keep pushing it on. We need to do more, which is great.
Excellent. And I was lucky enough to hear one of your young ambassadors, so Faduma Olo, speak actually at the Women and Girls in Sport conference. Very impressive young woman. So I just wondered, and she alluded to this a little bit, but what Youth Sport Trust doing to target those more diverse communities and engage disadvantaged young people? Yeah,
Faduma is she is one of my heroines, really. I met Faduma at least 12 years ago when she was involved in the Girls Active programme, and she was one of those young women who had a followership and understood she had influence, loved sport, wasn't necessarily an elite athlete in any sense, but just wanted to inspire her friends and help them feel some of the benefits she did. And she's just now, reporting for the Telegraph on women. I mean, doing amazing things. But anyway, so in terms of diversity, I think, we all know recent months have borne out again how much distance there still is to travel, and we can't have that reminded to us enough. I don't think, and I think the sports sector is trying to respond in absolutely the right way by not just philosophically being supportive, but tangibly, again, showing practical action which changes things. So a lot of what we've done around youth leadership has been to try and ensure that what used to be probably a white middle class sort of youth sport leadership program that we ran, not because we selected those young people, but they were self-selecting. They had the greatest opportunities often, the most support, and they emerged as the leaders. To be much more considerate now, again, a little bit like Girls Active, of not those people who are the leaders, but who have the potential to lead and who we need to lead, like those underrepresented girls, the girls that hated PE, they are the ones we need to lead PE. And whether it's young people from BAME communities, the LGBTQ community, really important for young people in sport, and indeed those from disadvantaged socioeconomic backgrounds for whom, often low aspirations is the biggest challenge. They have very few opportunities and they assume, therefore, there will be few opportunities for them, so they don't go looking for them. So our youth leadership program, I think, has been our main vehicle for doing that. And the creation, we have a youth board. The chair of our youth board sits on the main board of the Youth Sport Trust now. So they have a genuine voice, and our youth board is more diverse than our main board. And that, in part, I think, is a reflection that the board has come from the leadership pathway, and that pathway is more diverse now.
Excellent.
Yeah, and we just coming to the final year of our Breaking Boundaries project, which I don't know if you've heard of, Sue. It's a Spirit of 2012 Trust-funded programme inspired by the Cricket World Cup, which was all about empowering young people in communities around the country where there's a high BAME population, where there was a real passion for cricket, but different communities with the passion for cricket were playing cricket on their own. And how could we use the inspiration of the Cricket World Cup and young leaders to bring different communities together, whether that's white British, European, South Asian communities, all who might have had a passion for cricket, but together to play and together to watch and enjoy it. And through that, kind of break down some of those barriers, or take the name of the programme, break down the boundaries that exist between communities. And I think that's the obvious other thing, isn't it? Is as well as having leadership, it's the acceptance that we don't have to play in our segments, that there's a universal language of sport. And if it's cricket that we love, that's a great environment to then break down other boundaries that keep us separate in the rest of our life.
Absolutely. And finally, just wrapping up, what does success look like for you personally? And what more do you feel you'd like to achieve in the future?
Well, I think right now, success for me looks like helping the YST to recover from the last 5 months. It's by no means a certain future for any of us, and we've got challenges like others with sustainability and what the new normal looks like and what that means for us. So I'm always careful in how I talk about this, but my job is not to keep the Youth Sport Trust alive. My job is to keep the mission alive. And if we don't do a good enough job of spreading that mission and making the case for the mission, then the charity won't survive. Or if the mission isn't relevant and isn't what's needed and important, then the charity won't survive. So I'm treading, a very careful and strong line here about not getting my focus on just keeping the charity alive. But of course, if the charity dies, there's one less organisation fighting for the mission. But success would really look like, I guess, in the short to medium term, post-COVID, we play some part in redressing the decline in children's physical activity levels. I would love to see physical education and daily physical activity sitting alongside English, maths and science kind of enshrined in our education system. That would be a huge kind of success. But that won't just be the YST. That's an army of people championing that. And on a personal level, I think success will, if the charity survives, success will look like, I won't be able to do quite what Sue did, but something similar is that when I leave, the charity goes on to bigger and better things. And I've got an amazing leadership team and an extraordinary whole team at the YST full of wonderful people. And I do genuinely think if I walked away tomorrow that there is an abundance of talent and ability and ambition in there. So probably success looks like moving on, I guess, and leaving them to it. I probably answered a question I should have asked myself maybe a couple of years ago. Thank you, Sue.
Thanks so much to Ali for talking so openly about her career and sharing more about the incredible work the charity does to change the lives of young people. Thank you for all your lovely comments on social media. It's been fantastic to hear people are enjoying the podcasts. If you could take a moment to leave a rating or a review, that would be brilliant. Thanks to Sport England for their kind support for this series, and also to Sam Walker, who's been a fantastic executive producer for The Game Changers. If you'd like to find out more about any of the 41 incredible women from this and the previous series, head over to our website, fearlesswomen.co.uk. My guest next week is the utterly extraordinary Ebony Rainford Brent, A former England cricketer, World Cup winner, sports broadcaster at the BBC and Sky, and now Director of Women's Cricket at Surrey. It's a fabulous conversation. Please subscribe now so you don't miss it.
I hit the ball, it was like a plastic bat, we were on a concrete playing field and the orange ball flew out the cage and I was like, wow, like I was just hooked. That was it really. Once I hit my first ball and I was running around with all the boys in the playground, that was it, I was in.
The Game Changers. Fearless women in sport.